Hello, everybody, and welcome to yet another Duo Chat related pairing session. And I'm very happy to have teamed up with Aaron today because there was a quite interesting problem to encounter the other day, and we are going to speak today about I was about to say VS Code extension, but it's actually all the extensions kind of. So the middle layer between extensions and the API, and therefore also the DuoChat API that we are working on in our team. But before I say anything wrong, Aaron, can you just grab the screen and give us a really quick introduction about the problem? Because I know you're the absolute expert on this.
Yeah, absolutely. There's definitely a number of experts across the team, but at Summit, one of the things I did is I created a poster on this because one of the frustrations just developing for Community Edition, Enterprise Edition, self-managed users, which are maybe a milestone or more behind, sometimes several milestones behind, and then GitLab.com users, which are actually ahead of the current milestone because they have like whatever the next releases .pre version enabled on their instance. Whenever someone's talking to it, just going through all of those, it's caused some frustrations where you get little quirks in the UX, or maybe you update a query or a request, or maybe a request isn't present or has different permissions. So that's essentially the summary of the problem. So I've got this sort of poster here, which sort of like sums it up into a few pieces. Essentially, when you think of the GitLab CLI and the different editor extensions as clients, as well as the GitLab language server. So the language server is used by all of the extensions. So we have some calls to the REST API and some calls to the GraphQL API inside of the language server, which makes the problem a little bit better because we're not having to fight this problem and reinvent the wheel over and over and add version compatibility and testing into every single project every single time we have an API that changes between GitLab versions. But we still have the problem of requests that are directly inside of the extensions. We still have to do the testing and make sure they're robust enough so they don't break if we're talking to the older client version than expected. Um, so Yannick, do you have something?
Yeah, I just wanted to absolutely to sum it up very briefly as if in um I don't know too much about the language server, and I'm more than happy to learn about it in a second. But from a duo chat perspective, that really means for the VS Code extension, the basically how this problem occurs or how you run into this is from your extension you can authenticate, or when you install it you authenticate with your GitLab instance, which in our case usually that is why engineers are often surprised by this. In our case often is gitlab.com, and if that is the case there is zero problem, but many times this instance is going to be a self-managed, and this is where things become interesting because we just don't know which version the self-managed instance is running on, and it is absolutely fine and possible, and it happens a lot of times that self-managed instances are just not yet on the latest and greatest. So this is where things are getting really interesting in terms of the API, and obviously also the client-side code then kind of expecting the API. So, there are a couple of examples where we run into, or where we've been running into these issues. Do we want to kind of showcase them and speak about the fixes just yet, or is there anything else you wanted to speak about regarding the bigger architecture of this?
No, I think you definitely summed it up well. Right now, the VS Code extension does a lot of authentication and connections to Duo Chat. And then in JetBrains, we've duplicated the logic, right? Those are two editors right now that actually have Duo chat capabilities. We're
Mhm.
trying to centralize some of the logic. John Slaughter's been working on moving WebView and creating a single source of truth for the IDE chat experience. And so with that, it's going to be in one place that we manage those queries. But currently, we have JetBrains and VS Code extension both authenticating and then checking feature flags, checking if they have Duo chat available. There's a couple of different fields that we query the API for during the authentication authorization process to say whether we even show the Duo chat window inside of the ID.
Gotcha.
And then from that
Gotcha.
stage, that window doesn't sort of have any context of, hey, what version am I talking to? It just knows that we've like defined some GraphQL queries, and those GraphQL queries are what is called by the front end code. And then we have to think about keeping that compatible with the GitLab UI
Okay, okay,
project. So yeah,
cool.
I think we can definitely drill into one of the examples. I think one of the
We Before we go there, just one brief thing on that topic because you just mentioned the language server. With a limited understanding of what the language server does or will do in all details, but to get it right, the problem we're currently speaking of, that will stay, right? We will have to, whatever enhancement we are doing around this, like this is just an architectural product, like the way our product works at the end of the day. So this is something that will, no matter the level of refactoring, this will stay with us, right?
Exactly. So right now, what happens is for every extension that we expose to a chat in, we have to solve the problem again, and we have to solve it separately. Whereas when we migrate to the language server, we'll only have to solve it in one place. So we'll have
Okay.
to solve it in the GitLab UI project. Well, two places. You have the GitLab UI, and then you can pull the GitLab UI into the monolith. So the version update is there. And then you'll have to pull the GitLab UI changes into the language server project. And so then there'll be two places to solve it instead of whatever number of extensions that we support Duo Chat in.
Gotcha. Okay, so it's basically just about bundling, you could say in that context. Understood. Awesome. Cool. So yeah, we've got a couple of example issues where these are very, very common within the extension world and the duo chat world. So let's look into them and see what the problem's actually been and how to work around these.
Yeah, absolutely. I think one good example is recently there was a new platform origin attribute added. So on GitLab.com, the backend change was pushed out to be compatible with the front end. So the front end in GitLab.com and excuse me, and the most updated version of the GitLab VS Code extension. If you had to update a client, you were using the new field, and that wasn't a problem. But for self-managed users, once we did that upgrade, and if you were on the latest version of the VS Code extension with the old version of GitLab, so you're using the old version of the GitLab API, which didn't support this field, it caused a breaking change. So whenever you tried to use chat and send a message, it failed because there was a field that didn't exist in the old GraphQL schema, which is what the old instance is using or your self-managed instance was using. And so that just caused a compatibility issue there and which created a bug. And so
Yep. Yeah, thanks for summarizing it perfectly. That was a very interesting day at the office because it really showcased that such a minor little change in this case, like basically an existing GraphQL query adding a new field. What could possibly go wrong? We and I was one of the engineers working on this. We had no idea about the underlying complexity that we actually been running into. So yeah, the issue at the end of the day was the backend API and the client-side API. In certain cases where the backend wasn't updated, they ran out of sync. There was no fallback provided on the client side, which we should have. And Aaron's probably will show us in a bit how you do that. And that is then when things clashed. The good news in this case, I'm not too sure if that is true for all the issues that we're speaking of. Still, like it's not perfect, but from a user perspective, like updating their GitLab instance would have resolved the issue, right? Like we would have had the fix in place if things go wrong. It's another thing if they don't wanna or can't update,
yeah.
but it is not out of this world. Like it is not in a completely broken state. It's just yeah, a very inconvenient at the moment.
Yes, there would be two workarounds in place for the issue. It'd be upgrading your GitLab instance, which some GitLab admins just aren't able to do that. They have schedules for updating for self-managed. For dedicated instances actually run one milestone behind at all times. So for dedicated instances, the users would not be able to do something because that's a managed update. That
Very
managed
good point.
update is
Yeah.
one milestone behind. So the alternative there is before we introduce the breaking chain to the query, you would update to the previous extension version, to the previous working extension version. So in this case, this fix went out, I think in 5.0.0. whenever we released a new extension version. So the fix would have been rolling back to 4.9.13 or whatever the previous update was for the extension. And you can do that through the marketplace inside of VS Code and downgrade your extension. And once that was done, you'd be able to use the chat client again with no issues. So it can be complex depending on because the users don't necessarily have control of their GitLab instance version. So we do want to have a sort of the best experience for users on different versions.
Gotcha,
Um,
gotcha.
so yeah, what I was going to show here is as Yannick described it, like it's extremely simple in terms of this change, and like you wouldn't think this would break something, but because this field didn't exist in old versions, you can see this two-line change essentially, where we're adding a value for what the platform origin would be, and we're adding this string in because we're adding this string in which is not null. That's going to be always required in the query. And then because we always put it in the input then, even if it was nullable, because we always put in the input, if it's a field that is null but doesn't exist still, that would still break when you're sending that to the API. And so
Mhm.
what we have to do then is we have to entirely strip platform origin out in this input from the request, which is what I ended up doing when I added in the fix to when I added a fix. Unfortunately, this one I had to like maintain two queries. In the future, what I would love to see is if we have like a query builder, so we can literally have like directives, GraphQL supports directives.
Mhm.
I would love to see is if we could have the query and then on the query where we have fields that are optional or in a specific version,
Yep,
if
yep.
we could tag those as at minimum version 17.2. And then whenever we check the version against the GitLab server, we say, oh, this one's on 17.1, strip out all minimum version higher than that. And so at that stage, that would be usually a development experience improvement.
Mhm.
Whereas right now, I had to add in two separate query strings for the query before and after the change. And so this is literally the same query, but I've taken it back before the MR to add the new field. And then we have the 17.3 in later. Um, I think after discussions that that version number is wrong. It should actually say 2 versus 3. So we should revisit that and make sure the version is correct there. We can do that inside it. We can do that as part of the session too. Um, And that brings me to one of the next things. So right now we don't have like we have testing, our testing and integration testing and all is built against GitLab.com or staging.gitlab.com in a lot of cases, which of course is going to have the latest version of the API available to us and the latest version of the schema.
Mhm.
Our current integration testing and end-to-end testing doesn't catch for self-managed instances by default. You have to add in additional unit tests to cover old instance versions.
Yeah, great point. I didn't even think about this yet. So to hear correctly, the current tests are basically just testing the happy path. Like this is all latest and greatest and full stop. Okay, but testing against older releases. Good luck with that. That definitely sounds challenging to build as a test case. Also, like where do you make the distinction? Like when is too old and we don't care about anymore. So yeah, excited to see that, but that would for sure catch a lot of these things currently.
Absolutely. And there,
Gotcha.
I have some ideas around that as well that I can talk about. And we have like a Docker image that mocks some old versions of the schema, but it's not perfect.
I
I think
see.
like in the future, if what we could do is every time there's a tagged release in GitLab, if we create a new GraphQL schema, like a Docker image that's a mock like a that specific schema version, and then
Mhm.
mock the responses that's just gonna increase the coverage, like because then we can go and look at all the old version tags. Whereas right now it's whatever queries that you put in manually in the Docker image. So you
Mhm.
can put in queries and then say that you have a request header or something like that.
Gotcha.
Or you start the image with a particular flag so it behaves like one particular version.
Mhm. Cool, good stuff. Well, before we go all the way into test labs, what I just put on the agenda, or to sum it up, is make sure your queries that are called from the extensions, which in the dual chat context is basically every query, are backwards compatible on the client and the server, because this will be very much needed, and there's no other way you will be running into this. So this is for sure something which is also, to be fair, hard to reproduce locally. So it is. I need to find a good place in the docs where we can link to this in probably bold and a lot of font size, so we don't forget about it. Mm,
Yeah, so I'm shouting. I was gonna add to the docs.
yeah, the point you just removed from the agenda, and absolutely no worries about this. But speaking about like local reproduction, is that going to be trivial? You would kind of
Yeah, so
have.
I in the past when I've been running against the old GDK version, that isn't always reliable. Sometimes when you go to the previous milestone and multiple milestones behind especially, the GDK is not quite happy to play with you, and then you end up taking a day or two as a developer to get that working. And that's not that practical.
Oh, okay. Yeah, that really doesn't sound too practical, but I feel like, well, in best case we get some test coverage around this. Still, this seems like once you are aware of the problem, it actually seems like an easy enough problem to work around, even if you can't fully reproduce it. Because it's basically just like a safety net. You just have to apply, and then you should be good to go.
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the things is if there's new fields, and that's on inputs or on outputs, or return types or on input types. So in the case of
Mhm.
input, this is an input type, and that's put into the mutation. And so if there's new fields added there, or if there's new fields added to the actual like fields that you were asking to be returned from the query, in
Yep.
either case, you have to you have if those are newly added fields to the backend, you can know that okay, in previous milestones we don't have that field. So all
Mhm.
you have to do then is add a fallback inside the client's code, and you don't
Mhm.
have to necessarily do all the testing because the existing query that has been working already for those old versions has been tested and validated. And at the time of that milestone, there's end-to-end test coverage on that query potentially.
Mhm. Gotcha, gotcha. Thanks so much for going into that. One more thing that just crossed my mind before we go to the next example is what we just mainly like. We spoke about this issue. We looked at the client side code. It is pretty straightforward, or pretty clear at this point how the client side resolution for this can look. It's basically check for the version and then apply whatever GraphQL query is safe to use in that case. Okay. Looking on the backend changes and the API, is there anything that is on your mind where you'd be like, okay, handling a change like that would be considered a good or a best practice and also a really don't practice? Speaking about versioning these things.
Yeah, so we have some development guidelines already, and those are actually right on the mark in terms of what we should be doing. So, all right, so breaking changes. So this list of breaking changes, any breaking changes are going to break all clients. That's guaranteed. So if you're making any of these changes, because the important thing to look at here is that there's this list of exemptions, and a lot of Duo fields and Duo chat and Duo code suggestion fields are marked as at experimental, and
Mhm.
experimental fields are not subject to our normal breaking changes policy. And so
Mhm.
this is for folks developing extensions or contributing to extensions, they need to be aware of if they're making those breaking changes, even though it's not part of the deprecation policy and the breaking change policy for GitLab by default, that they still need to be mindful that they're not using an experimental query and then making a breaking change to that experimental query in a later version.
Oh, oh, okay. So to sum it up, even if you are working behind the experimental flag, it's not going to save you. Like this problem will still occur.
Exactly. If
Um,
there's any experimental fields that have been used in the extension, there's production clients using those experimental fields. So if you make a breaking change, even though it was an
mm,
experiment, you've broken like production users.
gotcha. Okay, cool. Yeah, thanks for highlighting this. This seems to be very important. Is it fair to say that there, like with the with the architecture that we're running on, there is no such thing as an experimental field at the end of the day. Because if it behaves like any other field and you have to maintain it, well, it's still great to have like the metadata on it and provide it. But yeah, to sum it up, these things they will behave in our case just like any other field, and we cannot rely on their additional safety net.
Yeah, absolutely. There's no safety net when you're using the public fields, essentially.
Gotcha.
It's great to have the metadata around, like you said, from the developer perspective, but it's purely right now, it's purely on the back end side.
Gotcha.
The front end, whether it's GitLab UI inside of the monolith directly or the extensions, do not benefit from fields being marked as experimental or not.
Gotcha. Okay, learning number two. Experimental GraphQL fields don't solve the problem either.
Yep.
Sweet. So we do have one more example, which is kind of same but different. Do you just want to jump into the agenda and click the...
Yes, is this for the slash commands or do you want?
Yeah. Let's start with the slash command. It is gonna be rather easy to show the like one thing to watch out in this particular example, like the feature that was planned on being worked on was to basically adjust the or remove one of the current slash commands that we're currently having. And the interesting part about this slash command in the current state of our code base actually had occurrences, or it was being referred to in the GitLab UI shared UI library that we're using in all of the glue codes, integration codes, whatever you want to use it, for every host system, GitLab.com, all the extensions, and the backend. So now things are getting rather interesting. From the things that we or from the problem that we just spoke about, we are already aware about a problem being in the backend and in the integration layer. But this is now something where you'd be like, it goes as far as the shared UI library. It is also, if you are aware of it, a rather easy fix. You just have to make sure that also the UI library in this case is backwards compatible, or in best case, it doesn't even, or make it as dynamic that it doesn't even have to know about this information. But if it does, then just make it adjustable using a prop or whatever the technique. So yeah, that's basically where we at this point. It is same but different. Point we should definitely highlight here is this might affect systems you don't really expect it to be, as it matters for the UI library, which API we're running against.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, yeah, like you said, it ends up being a prop inside of the like this is the mock data, so this isn't useful. But let's see, in the view components, I think there's a prop around slash commands as well.
There definitely is.
I could open this project locally to help navigate or hmm.
If you just search for props in DuoChat view,
Didn't think I'd be opening this one locally.
you might want to see the whole file though, because you've got it highlighted under there. Like, seems to be perfect. DuoChat.view. There we go. And if you search for slash commands, yeah, there's a prop. Array of slash commands to display in the chat, it says. Just search for array of slash and then you should be there. We go.
One up. There you go. Okay, so yes, there's a prop here.
Yep, that is where we're at now. So yeah, that is definitely something to...
Cool. Yeah, and then from the VS Code extension side, then
Okay, we gotta wait. The array of slash commands, the the description is actually pretty misleading. What this prop does, what we just showed you, is to actually highlight the help menu of the slash commands. The thing is, though, there is some logic that is running behind some of the slash command, which is actually not a prop at this point, which got us into the problem. So if you would type slash clear, there would be some logic as if we would empty the chat. Client side only at this point, and this would be the changes that we would need to make sure that they are running against the right API. So that was the idea behind it. Yeah, making this also configurable via prop and hopefully provide a better name to not run into the same thing we just did would be a fix. So just something to be cautious about.
Yep. And then, yeah, if we search for slash clean, yeah, we have these special messages concept instead of each extension. So each extension has to say, what messages am I going to interpret as a literal command to pass into the API rather than a chat message? There's special handling on the client side, as you described.
Gotcha. Awesome. We do have one more example where we can showcase the challenge about using different API versions.
Cool. Yeah, and then so the last one is related, but instead of being specific around version numbers, this one is actually related to the distribution that we're using for GitLab. So it's not so some security reports features like the security dashboards and stuff are ultimate only features. So if you're a user that is on a community edition instance of GitLab, that means you won't have access to these ultimate only or enterprise only fields. And what that ends up meaning is that the GraphQL API won't have the fields when we run. So the way we develop with the like existing like lib GraphQL folder, anything under there is available to community edition users for free users. But if it's a field that's under the EE path inside while you're developing the GitLab like project, if it's under EE, then it's actually a field that's only available to enterprise users. So if the fields you're adding are under EE slash and they're in the extension on the back end, then you have to make sure that whatever client side you have is the client is checking whether you are an enterprise user or not. So we can see here there's go ahead.
Take a quick step back. So if I'm hearing you correctly, got a VS Code extension running, and so far we've been speaking about plugging in a GitLab instance, which might not be on the latest version, which causes problem. But in this case, the user actually might be on the very latest. But and it's also so the version number can also be old. Like these things can double up. But imagine being on the latest version, that's okay. It is not about licensing, right? But it might be a GitLab community edition running that actually doesn't, it's CE only, it doesn't care. You can basically
Yeah,
can't, you cannot add a license to it. That's kind of weird. And that is what you need to check for.
exactly. So it's not the license. License would be like particular add-ons around Duos.
Mhm,
There could be like a Duo. You could have your Duo Pro add-on. You could have your Duo Code Suggestions add-on
mhm,
on your whatever subscription your administrators bought. But
mhm,
as a user, you're not able to see any of that, right? So as a user, it's just whether you're Enterprise Edition, so whether your instance has is installed as Enterprise Edition or whether it's Community Edition.
mhm,
And so as a user of Community Edition, though, even if you're on the very latest and greatest version number, any fields and GraphQL mutations, queries, any operations in general, any of those that are not defined inside of the like the shared path
mhm,
inside of the code base, you won't have access to those fields. So what we've done in the case of the VS Code extension is we've added in a require enterprise flag. So if you need to validate the GitLab version number, you
mhm,
can do that. Plus, you can also validate that your instance is a enterprise GitLab installation. And so at that stage, then you gain the ability, we then using that, we can see here that for the REST API, there's a version metadata REST API, and it returns whether you're enterprise or not. And so we've added a protection here where for the security reports, we actually do a check of that. So we check whether, so for security findings, you need to be on like 16.1 at least, and you also must be an enterprise user. And then we add a fallback based on whether that's true or not.
Gotcha, gotcha. Okay, thanks for highlighting this specific thing again. I'm very pleased to have found an issue that, at least for once, is not directly affecting us at DuoChat because we're EE only. But who knows? We're EE only today. Things are moving quickly. That might change at one
Well,
point as well.
that's it. Yeah, because we're Duo Chat is EE only, it's better. And the way that's we protect and ensure it's EE only is we actually do a few license checks and subscription checks before we even try to load Duo Chat features.
Now that
Um,
you say the check obviously works in both ways. Yeah. So we are actually affected. Yeah, sure.
but we do a pre-flight check in this case though, because we know that Duo is only going to be available behind certain flags.
Mhm.
So the way that works then is we have a get project licenses request. And so we can see in this request, we'll be able to say query get project. This is what the query looks like. And this query, we know only certain GitLab, you can only have certain GitLab versions for this. And
Mhm.
so if you don't have a GitLab version for this, you're not actually able to use the add-ons. So we don't have to worry about it, presenting users to this and then not having a compatible API.
Mhm.
We're able to say like whether you have Duo features enabled and then whether you have code suggestions enabled. And then we also have a Duo chat available as another query.
Gotcha.
So there's a couple of like project level, like so administrators from the project level on like the settings, they can
Mhm.
set project settings, instance settings, group settings around Duo features in some cases.
Mhm.
And this is also true for feature flags. So because we had these queries, we're able to check all of that without necessarily knowing about subscription and stuff like that. Because there's like an admin is able to specify whether Duo is enabled for their project or not.
Okay, okay, cool. Thanks for showcasing that check. So, added another learning to the agenda. The backwards compatibility problem doesn't only affect versions. Keep community editions in mind. Make sure you're checking for it before accessing EE only resources. Did I get you right? Awesome. Cool. This answered a lot of my questions, and I'm really hoping that this is going to be a good resource to deal with all the complexity that just comes along with serving so many host systems. Is there anything on your mind that we didn't speak about yet that really we should know about?
I think we've covered a lot of the stuff here. The future things is better documentation for developers. Like I think we couple like even on this call we've identified a couple of points where hey, we probably could have documented this better so developers knew it going into it. Because right now I think our documentation is very specific around back end and front end, which is all monolith. So it doesn't even go into GitLab UI right
Mm.
now, which that shared UI components obviously affects the extensions and it affects the front end as well.
Gotcha. Awesome. Yeah, let's create a couple of follow-ups so we can enhance our docs. But yeah, my questions are for sure answered. Thanks so much for this tour in version land. And yeah, speak to you soon. Thanks so much, Erin.
Yes, thank you.
Have a good one.